Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to be talking about teaching across different modalities. You've already had exposure to some background information about how I think about teaching across different modalities. And so this is more of a candid conversation with Dr. Riquino and Dr. Weiner-Davis to talk about the reality of just like what it feels like to teach across those modalities and how we all have our own personal preferences and strengths too. Michael, why don't you start with introductions of introducing yourself, your positionality in the school, and what you've typically taught and the modalities you taught in, and then we'll follow up with Tadeo after you.
Wonderful. Hi, Michael Ricchino. I am an associate professor within the School of Social Welfare, and I actually just started my 11th year of teaching. Before coming to the University of Kansas, I spent a lot of time teaching across the MSW curriculum, undergrads, graduate students. Since coming to KU, I have exclusively taught in the clinical specialization of the MSW program. That's my sweet spot. That's my preferred space of teaching. So yeah, clinical stuff.
In modalities?
Right, you said modalities. I primarily teach in person. I also teach the blended course where it's half in person, half asynchronous. I have experience teaching online, both where it is synchronous learning online through a teleconference platform, also fully, completely asynchronous online. And I have thoughts and feelings about those, but primarily I teach in person.
Okay, that's good. Tadeo.
Hi, my name is Tadeo. He, him pronouns. I'm an assistant professor, just started my third year in the school. I teach at the bachelor's level the social policy courses, and at the master's level, also the similar or related social policy and advocacy, but also the advanced macro classes. And in terms of modalities, I've done both the in-person and the blended in-person and asynchronous, but I've never done fully online or completely asynchronous.
And you're in a different place in kind of your teaching journey too. So it's helpful to think about that today is at kind of this early, like emerging phase where you're still exploring, right? And then I've got 15 plus years under my belt, so I probably codified my opinions. And then Michael's getting to that like old curmudgeon-y stage too. So thank you for the introductions. I think what I would like to do is to think about if you have a preference across modalities, and if so, why? Like, what are the things that draw you to that specific modality? Because I think one of the things we talk about is students often, not always, but often have a choice into what modality they take as those opportunities expand. Sometimes they're forced in. So, like our macro curriculum typically is defaulted to online. Synchronous, asynchronous. Sometimes we offer it blended in-person asynchronous, but it varies. And that can be hard for students who don't want to take a fully online space. Or DSW similar, where it's all synchronous, asynchronous, for instance. So there's less of a choice there also. But as instructors, we also kind of have the similar situation where we often have choices where we teach, and sometimes the course content that we want to teach maybe in a modality that's not our personal preference or there's logistical issues. So it's interesting to think of the instructor having similar choices that the students have. So I'm curious because they've already heard my spiel. So like I'm curious what is your personal preference and why, and the particular strengths that you find in that teaching in that particular space.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, particularly because I expressed an opinion while I was introducing myself. For me, I think that the primary reason teaching in person is my preferred modality has a lot to do with the content that I'm teaching. Since I'm teaching in the clinical specialization, I primarily teach classes like clinical practice strategies or mental health and psychopathology, which I think because of the way I approach teaching, which is kind of akin to, say, nursing. We'll talk about a concept, I then demonstrate the concept, and then they practice role playing the concept, and then we debrief the concept. I think having that in-person space allows for easier demonstration, communication, like essentially making it akin to like a group psychotherapy process while also modeling the skills associated with individual psychotherapy. I've done it online. I've done it through kind of a synchronous platform. And in that case, I typically think of it as like modeling telehealth therapy sessions. But there is something different about learning the content in person versus learning the content online, even through something like a synchronous Zoom space, where since it is about kind of this interaction, if I'm online, I'm kind of constrained by this box of what it is that people can see versus in person. We can see each other in our entirety, and that really aligns with the way we might think about clinical practice and the way that we engage with clients. I do make students, even in my in-person class, I do make them do assignments where they have to record, say, telehealth role plays because I want them to get that experience because we see so much service that is delivered via telehealth. But in terms of the initial building of those skills, I find in-person to be the most effective. I've also found blended to work as well, where it's, half in person, half asynchronous. I think that that works particularly well for students who have a lot of practice experience already. So maybe they've been working as generalist practitioners for years as a case manager, hospital settings, school settings, et cetera. And now they're coming back to get that kind of clinical experience, the clinical specialization, the MSW. And for them, they can cover a lot of their kind of own content because it's already part of their practice experience. They're building upon their practice experience, but then we can still come together every other week in person to really practice in role plays and in conversation, in live discussion, the different clinical
Yeah, I
skills.
like that because it builds upon a component we didn't really add into the paper that I wrote with Dr. Coles, which was the different modalities may also be more beneficial for different stages of practice or different stages of learning. And so there is something about being in a room with like a captive audience, and really being able to model the nonverbal and the full physical responding, versus just verbal and facial that we typically are constrained by on Zoom. Um, and then thinking about where that self-guided component made dialogue better with people who already have a lot of personal examples and resources to tap into. Because at the bachelor's level and sometimes in the traditional MSW, I found some students are coming to us with very limited practice experience. And so they're needing to get those examples provided to them through case studies or demonstrations. Whereas, like, when I've taught long-term practitioners, they're the ones bringing in the experience that they can reference. So that's a really, really that's an interesting design element when thinking about how to counsel students too. Today, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you had asked me a year ago which was my preferred modality, I would have said in person, but that was probably because that's what I was most comfortable with. And once I gave the blended asynchronous and then in person synchronous a try with the help of your paper and then sort of in conversation with you, Nancy, it actually I'm thinking that I might really enjoy continuing to focus on that. But as you're saying, I think it's with advanced macro master's students who I think I can clearly communicate expectations about the asynchronous engagement, um, as long as they feel that it's sort of um, put together in a way that it makes sense, that the asynchronous speaks to the synchronous activities. So I mean, I'm still developing on that, but I think some of the asynchronous um, classes allows for a type of engagement that doesn't is not as amenable to the in-person classes. Maybe some more in-depth reading into some of the abstract theoretical stuff. Some individual reflection, with the expectation that when we do come together, there's going to be pretty intense and rigorous engagement with each other. And as long as I was upfront about that, I think folks really, really followed along in a way that I wasn't able to do in the more traditional in-person classes. And so that was nice. At first I was very apprehensive about taking on the blended modality, but it ended up opening up different ways of engaging in the classroom, which I really appreciate and I want to continue sort of building on.
I think what you're speaking about that's helpful for me too is that there's an intentionality that you brought to trying out something new. And I have experienced this too, that every time I'm trying a new modality, there's not like a little bit, there's kind of an immense type of fear that I face, which is how am I going to do this? Um, I I hold high standards for myself in my teaching. So like when things don't go well because I'm figuring it out or I feel uncomfortable when I started with different modalities, I think I had that comfort piece of like what am I comfortable in, did I get trained in, and how that translates over, I think is huge for all of us. And it's a good reminder that something new always comes with apprehension and that, but I appreciate also what you said, which is when you're transparent with the students about kind of your expectations and the flow of the course and how you're very purposefully leveraging the asynchronous and synchronous weeks, that you can get buy-in. And Michael and I just wrote a paper where we're talking about like clinical analogs of teaching and, in that transparency of informing a client what to expect, like what the process is going to be like is no different than what we're doing with these different modalities. I still love teaching in person because there's something I have energetically, non-verbally, that students pick up on that does not translate in the same way via technology like this. And I've been told that. Um, I think that I've done well in fully online, like whether it's synchronous, asynchronous, or even asynchronous because I give a lot of feedback. And when I do engage students, it's typically high energy, which I think translates well. Which is funny because actually in person I'm a little much. Online I'm like just enough. Um, and so I've found as I've dived into each type of modality, it taps into a different set of strengths I have. Um, and I am fortunate enough to have a diversity of pedagogical strengths that I can adapt. But I think it's really fair, like, is it like when I'm in an administrator setting, to also acknowledge that some people just don't like certain types of settings. So, one of my friends teaches a school that has a fully asynchronous online social work program. And she says that the way it's run through a third party, she literally, it's just a bunch of names and she's grading papers and she can't actually alter the content. I think that's an extreme kind of worst case scenario as an academic. I don't think I would enjoy that. Like where I have no control over the content, that I'm just basically a grader. There are other models of fully asynchronous that I think a lot of schools haven't explored, which is where the instructor still has a level of content and can engage with students in a more personal manner. So even though they're all operating at different times, like I, as an instructor, could infuse myself more into the process. I have not seen that happening right now. So I personally have avoided the fully asynchronous space because of that. Um, and I like the different modalities for different reasons, but it has taken me years of experimenting and figuring out what's the sweet spot for me. My challenge now as more of a senior scholar is that what I pedagogically believe is beneficial across those different modalities isn't always what's being reinforced or asked of me by higher institutional structures that are really focused on efficiency and consistency. And that's now where I have tensions, which is like, I like this, but not if you're going to make me teach it in this way, because it counters like my understanding of the literature and the science behind the best teaching practices. So I'm navigating that more complex space, which is a lot easier to do not as an administrator and as just a faculty. So I'll name.
One of the things you mentioned, Nancy, that kind of stood out to me was thinking about also what energetically kind of fills you up as the instructor. So you said there's something about being in person where how you show up in that space not only works for students, but I think also works for you. I have a colleague who actually really loves teaching fully asynchronous. She misses a little bit of the relational piece. She does like getting to know students, but she's able to get to know students in other ways. In her particular MSW program, every MSW student has to do kind of a capstone project. And so she's able to do this kind of like intensive one-on-one mentoring with students, which is actually kind of her preferred way of engaging with students. Whereas with a classroom of students, she doesn't actually, she discovered over time she doesn't particularly enjoy that. And so the fully asynchronous allows her to focus on giving good feedback. She's really good at giving feedback, and she doesn't have to worry about kind of like managing the group space. Contrast that with me, where one of my favorite things about teaching in person is I love the kind of like spontaneity of the conversation that can happen. I always encourage my students to like, I'm like, you don't even need to raise your hand, just kind of like speak as if this were kind of a group therapy space. And it doesn't mean that we don't sometimes talk over each other, but there is this energy that happens in that really spontaneous group discussion where even through, say, a synchronous platform like Zoom, the interruptions are much more awkward on Zoom than they are in person. And so I can't quite do that same sort of fluid, spontaneous discussion in a synchronous or even obviously not in an asynchronous online space as I can when I'm in person, which is why I kind of prefer that. So I do think that there's something about finding what works for individuals. So like what works for me and what kind of motivates me and excites me when it comes to teaching. A lot of that is the in-person stuff because of the way that it works.
Yeah, like I'm cognitively monitoring differently across different spaces. So, like in person, I'm reading energy, nonverbal behaviors, I'm tracking how people are talking. People will have side conversations in addition to group level conversations. We may interrupt each other, but I grew up in a family where we always interrupted each other, so that doesn't bother me. And so the in-person classes actually often run more chaotically but fluidly because there's that real-time pivoting. I do really well with real-time pivoting too. Like Michael's watched me before where I can like kick out an agenda and create a new agenda on the spot if that's what the students ask for. So that's a particular strength of mine. Whereas what I found with the Zoom synchronous form or interactive form is that how I use silence and then monitor student engagement feels a little different. And so I'm having to monitor the chat simultaneously as what when people are speaking up. Um, it's really hard to read people because they're seeing often their own faces too. So people are actually controlling their responses much more than they would in person spontaneously. So sometimes people appear really placid, even though there's a lot going on underneath. Um, and so it's hard to have authentic, genuine responding. And so there's often I'm having to monitor differently, or if there's a long pause and people aren't responding, it could be that I've asked a question that people are thinking about, or people were shopping for shoes and totally disengaged. They don't even know what I was asking, or that what I was asking doesn't make sense. And I've had to learn how to on understand what that means in the synchronous space with less information. And I think as like someone who's clinically trained, the more information, the better. And so I've had to more verbally ask or there's it's I don't know if you guys have this experience too, but students will often be less open to speaking up in the intimacy of a Zoom space than they will in a classroom space, even though there may be the same number of students and I don't know if it's the intensity of seeing everybody's faces, whereas like in a classroom, people actually aren't looking at each other. So thinking about attentional focus on what you're seeing, I haven't quite sorted that out yet. Tadeo, do you have thoughts?
No, as you were talking, I was really, in the spirit of sort of figuring out what my sweet spot is going to be and also what energizes me. I really was thinking that, I've come to like the blended asynchronous synchronous, but the synchronous has been in person, and I think that's really important for me. I think it would be a different experience if the synchronous component was online. And that's because not only does the in-person engagement energize me, but I think this is part of my background in community spaces and community organizing, but I think that a certain sort of energy in the room with students is necessary to discuss some of the topics. And as you are pointing out, it's just a lot harder to sort of create that same energy dynamic on Zoom spaces because we sort of we get energy from each other in physical space in a way that we just can't in little boxes. And so um So now I have something else to be apprehensive about in a future blended course.
That's right. Well, it's the what inspired writing this paper was online forums weren't very common pre-COVID in our context, but I had taught online all the way as early as 2012 because I was working with USC and they were one of the first online programs for social work. And so my training had been situated across multiple modalities. And during COVID, I was tasked with helping a lot of professors transition through our Center on Teaching and Excellence. And one of the things that you said today that kind of sparked a thought in my head around why we wrote this paper was that if I don't feel, so why I called it Maintaining the Magic was like, if I don't feel that endorphin rush of like, I've been a process of transmitting and receiving with a bunch of people, and I can feel the growth and the energy and the excitement. Teaching loses its thing that I love. And teaching is one of those scholar spaces for me that's a generative space that keeps me going. And so um when I shifted online, what I found was if I try to do in person what I'm doing online, it feels miserable because of all things we talked about. And it doesn't translate. And so one of the things I've always had to do, which it takes me a while to get back into it if I haven't done online work for a long time, is try to start leaning into like what is unique about this space and what is equally generative about this space, but it may actually look very different than if I chose to teach in person. Um, and and so this is an example where I um, inherited a course and it's laid out in a very traditional in-person sort of way. And after the first two synchronous sessions, like I was doing a teaching reflection afterwards, and I was thinking like this doesn't align with what feels good for me. And so I've decided to kind of pivot and restructure the synchronous sessions to be more interactive and playful and engaging because all the seriousness is happening in the asynchronous spaces and the assignments. And so and I was like, and there were things I was tracking. I'm talking too much. And I know I'm talking too much because I don't have a good sense of all the individuals in the room. So I need to do more interactive work. I'm seeing people kind of disengage in a way where it's like, oh, I need to do more kind of active learning and active engagement to keep people focused on the online forum. And so it was like a quick pivot of like, which is actually an interesting mechanism I use now that I think about it, which is that if I feel like it's not going well, it's probably not going well. Or if I feel bored, or if I feel kind of like, then I know it's probably not going well for everybody else. And so it forces me to pivot into like a problem solving mode of like, let's make this feel better. Because who wants to show up and like be bored out of their minds? And and every time I move back into a fully online space, I'm reminded like, oh, I can't do it like I did it in the other ones. Or like what you were saying today, I thought was really cool about the blended was learning that they can engage deeply intellectually during the asynchronous weeks and then do more intensive application work, and that it actually feels good because sometimes in our traditional in-person classes that those readings or the kind of that more thoughtful self-introspective space isn't privileged. And so and I like Michael's example too of his friend who maybe likes the intellectualization that happens with giving feedback and engaging students individually, and how asynchronous spaces allow that to be the predominant bulk of their work. And so there's actually much more individual engagement at that level. But it's more intellectual, I think, than emotional, and I like the socio-emotional part too. Other thoughts that you guys have as we wrap up?
One thought that came earlier when Tadeo was describing that kind of blend of in-person synchronous and then that asynchronous week, I often frame the asynchronous weeks when I'm teaching blended courses as choose your own adventure, or I'll provide them with very specific required materials I want them to review, and then I provide them with a whole list of recommended materials. And I think, as you were noting, Nancy, when it's in person every single week, the opportunity to review those recommended materials, there's often just not enough time between all the different things that my students are doing. But in those blended sections, they do have not only do they do the required readings, they often then do dive into those recommended materials. And so when they come back to the in-person class, there is this really kind of interesting and robust and deep conversation. Not that we don't have those in the in-person spaces for the weekly in-person, we do, but it's a different type of conversation because they had that asynchronous week to kind of dive deeply into some things. So yeah, choose your own adventure. I do like that aspect of the asynchronous weeks.
I like the framing of choose your own adventure. And and one of the struggles we have right now is a lot of our learning management systems are structured for efficiency, similar across all the modalities, but then it creates extra work for the instructors to think about, no, I want these weeks to be choose your own adventure. So I'm going to have to mix it up. Um, and so I would say as you move more and more online, and this is true in the literature, to do it well, it means doing a lot of upfront work as an instructor and shaping experiences rather than kind of the in the fly, in the moment, pivoting and adjusting. And so I think also it's about where am I allocating my energies and how does that differ across the different modalities. And I do think it's possible to equally like each one, but what I like about this conversation is an element that's not in the paper, which is we all have different strengths and different things that we enjoy as instructors, and those may lend themselves to one modality over another. And from like a mentoring standpoint for faculty, that would be a really interesting conversation to have, particularly with early career faculty. There's also thinking about the skill sets that are required to think about how to adjust and how to think about each modality differently so that you do get a good experience and that you could teach the same section in two different modalities and have to teach them very different ways to get that same feeling or the same outcome, but that it's possible and having that be a more open conversation among faculty would be really good too. Tadeo, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I just have really enjoyed the conversation and um yeah, I mostly wanted to come on here to hear from you all on teaching. So thank you.
Yeah, it's we are trying more and more to have open dialogue around teaching because and I think this is what's really being reinforced with teaching the DSW class on curriculum design and development is much like clinical practice or macro practice. There's what's in the books, and then there's the complications of actually doing it. And ideally, and so like we just talked about program goals and how program goals are actually the hardest thing for me to facilitate as a director because they're so vague and so specific at the same time, and they need to be vague to give us room to really develop a whole curriculum and be able to change and tweak the curriculum without changing the goals. But also, like, they're supposed to give us enough specificity to say this is what's leading or guiding the focus of how we're developing our programming. And so my joke was, we spend 10 to 50 hours talking about one phrase for it to be the most generic basic phrase ever. Um, and that and so in this case with modalities, it's like, yes, there's lots of different modalities and they can all be possible, but they have their own challenges and they interact with you as an instructor, and as an instructor gaining insight into that, I think humanizes the process too. Because I can say, like, it still scares me to try a new modality even when I haven't done it in a while, or it scares me to start a new course because I'm like, "Ugh, like, I don't know what's going to work." And so you have to face that part of yourself that is wholly imperfect. Um, and I don't know if, like I'm in a point in my career is like, it's like, I don't know, is it helpful to tell like a full range of faculty? Like Nancy doesn't know what the hell she's doing sometimes too, right? And I found that most people are like, oh, that's good. Because every time I teach, the context has changed. So last time I taught online, like fully synchronously, was a very different environment than now. And last time I taught one class, like the whole political structure changed. And so I imagine teaching a policy class 2 years ago and now are like different, right? And that it makes teaching exciting, but also hazardous. And so I'm hoping to convey that it's okay to have those doubts and feelings as you start engaging this work, because all of us do. So, humanizing the process. Well, thank you both for your time, and I appreciate your insights. It's definitely helpful.
Yeah, thanks
Yeah.
for having me.
All right.